cloud. Welcome everyone who is coming on. We're excited you're joining us. I'm going to give us 1 minute and we'll get started. I think I'm going to kick us off. So welcome everyone who is joining us. I see lots of folks popping on to the webinar. Welcome, welcome. My name is Jamie Klobuchar. I'm the Executive Vice President here at Evolve Giving Group, and I am so excited that you're all joining us today to talk a little bit more about quiet quitting. We have an awesome group of panelists here today to kind of talk through this with you, give you some ideas about how you can deal with this in your nonprofit. So I just want to thank you all for being here. A couple of housekeeping issues that I'll get into quickly first is that if you have questions for the panelists, I really would like you to put those in the Q&A. I will be monitoring that and I'll be popping on and off to ask the questions of the panelists. Also, would love it if you would take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat and tell us a little bit about why you wanted to come here today and what you wanted to get out of this. That would be super helpful for us. And I also just think it's really interesting to see all the different reasons people join these things. Let me tell you a little bit about Evolve. We are a full service nonprofit management consulting firm. We're based in Chicago, but we've got consultants all over the country now. We do work in fundraising, we do work in the talent space, and we also do a great deal of training about things like board and governance, topics like this. So we're excited to have you here today. And why don't I give you a little bit of background on how we came to wanting to talk about this topic. I will say for our talent team, this has been a really, really busy year. We've got a lot of nonprofits reaching out to us to ask us for support in recruiting and also asking for help in just challenges that they're dealing with employee engagement, with keeping folks motivated, excited about their work. And all of a sudden, about a month and a half ago, we started seeing these articles popping up online about quiet quitting. And so much of what we saw in these articles was really reflected in the conversations that many of our consultants have been having with their clients over the last, I would say, about a year now. So we thought it would be an interesting topic to dive into with our wonderful esteemed panelists today. So I actually reached out to my colleague, Lisa Harper Chang, who's going to be actually moderating this panel for you today because she has a lot of interest in this topic and she had a lot of great questions about it as we started talking about it internally. So again, if you want to pop into the chat, tell us a little bit about why you're here today. I am going to turn this over to my colleague, Lisa. I'm going to pop off screen and I'll be monitoring the Q&A and the chat. So I just encourage you to let us know your thoughts. We want this to be as interactive as possible. We believe in conversations and not directed presentations. So Lisa, take it away.
Okay, and I want to acknowledge, I see the comments on the chat, so we are working on enabling that. So thank you so much for joining us today. As Jamie said, my name is Lisa Harper Chang, and I am a Senior Associate Consultant here at Evolve Giving Group. And I'm very excited to be able to be here with all of you, and thank you for sharing your time. We've had some amazing conversations leading into today with these incredible panelists. And so I'm just so excited that we finally get to share that with a broader audience. We're going to ask all the panelists actually to introduce themselves. And so I'm going to ask for their name, title, organization, and then why they're excited to be here. You've heard why I am. And we're going to ask everyone to identify within here. And certainly we'd love for you to identify this in the chat. What generation do you identify with, and what are your preferred pronouns? So for mine, I think earlier today, I was just referred to as a geriatric millennial. Which actually is an exennial. I know, it's a new term, right? I see Jared's response. And my preferred pronouns are she, her, hers. So I'm just going to start to who I see on my left, and that would be Cal, if you want to take this and then call on the next person.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Great to see you all, and I hope everyone is enjoying this so far. My name is Cal Marcus. I'm an associate consultant with Evolve Giving Group. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm really excited to have this conversation because there's certainly a lot of interest in this topic right now. And I also think it's really important for people from all generations and demographics to talk about this and, get to the bottom of things. So, you want me to call the next person, Lisa? Great. Let's go to Jared.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jared Jackson. I'm the founder and executive director of Hues in all Hues. Sorry, let me say that again. Hues in all Hues. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm calling in from Lenape land, otherwise known as Philadelphia. And I will pass it over to Jessi.
Thanks, Jared. Hi, my name is Jessi Moon. I'm the Senior Director of Development at Chicago Foundation for Women. I am also an elder millennial. I refuse to say geriatric. We're talking about our identities, right? So I use she, her pronouns. I'm really excited to be here because I lead a team of fundraisers. And so I need a really engaged team. And so I think having that conversation is important. And I'm happy to be here today to do that. Did I forget anything in your list of questions? You don't think so? Oh, I will say one shameless plug is CFW is currently hiring. So talking about engaged employees. So please take a look at our website and check out what we're those open positions. Thank you.
And Tenny.
Hi, everyone. I'm Odunsi. I am the manager of corporate and foundation relations at CFW. I am one of the engaged fundraisers on Jessi's team here at CFW. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I'm excited to be here today because I think it's a really worthwhile discussion, this concept of quiet quitting. But I think it's also important for workers, people who are doing this work, to be able to speak truth to power and speak to our experiences directly, as opposed to kind of an article or, other discussions kind of higher at the top, defining that experience for us. So really glad to be here.
Well, we are so glad that all of you are here. And Tenny, thank you so much for that entry point to the conversation. When we were doing our preparation calls, I think it was very clear that each of us had just issues with the term quiet quitting itself. And so I wanted to start today's conversation on that point and say, how would you define quiet quitting? And is that a term that you're comfortable with? And if it's not, what should we be using to refer to this sort of phenomenon? And I'll start with Cal.
Great. Thanks, Lisa. Getting right to the big questions. So I think what's really important for us to understand is, and this is in my opinion, of course, but quiet quitting really comes from not from a place of not wanting their job or not being excited about their job, but really just the different generations coming into the workforce now and not necessarily wanting to climb corporate or nonprofit ladders the same way they had wanted previously. They still want growth, they still want transparency, and they want to learn new things. But I think the biggest contrast, and we see this now in how different generations look at this, is how we define what growth looks like, how we define transparency, and how we understand the difference of how people want to learn in their jobs, and really trying to learn the things that they're passionate about, and really should redefine it. I think, whether it's goal completing or box checking, people are really excited about their work still. No one's actually quitting their jobs and when they're using this type of rhetoric, but I think it's really a generational thing, and it comes from communication needing to be stronger.
So Cal, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. Do you have a term that you would prefer that we use instead of quiet quitting, or are we okay using that term for today?
I personally like the box checking because it's really coming from a place of people being assigned their duties and their tasks and still being excited about it, but not necessarily trying to go above and beyond. I think that comes from a place of still wanting to accomplish their goals, but people are just starting to prioritize their personal lives and other things going on in their lives, not less than work, but as equally as they have been prioritizing their jobs.
Any other thoughts from our other panelists, like other terms you want to use? Or I mean, I felt like that was a very comprehensive answer. Thank you, Cal.
I would just say setting healthy boundaries would be the term that I would use. Just like, you know, a lot of people cry about like cancel culture, but it's really consequences, right? For people who maybe historically have been at a level of power who have not received the proper consequences for their actions.
Like that. So we have box checking and setting healthy boundaries. Jessi?
I'll co-sign boundary setting. I think too, at its core, quiet quitting can be a forcing function for management to really think about how, if we are asking folks to go above and beyond or to do more deeper engagement than their job description, to Cal's point, box checking that job description, really a forcing function to match that energy, right? And so I think in that way, quiet quitting is a tool of Gen Z to get what they need out of the workforce, which I think is showing useful utility.
Great. Jamie, I see you appear.
I appeared. So one of the questions we got in the chat that I think it's the good time to answer that, because Jared brought up the issue of boundaries, and Judy is asking, how do different generations define healthy boundaries? And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
It's a great question. Does anybody want to take that, or I'm happy to call on somebody, but
I can hop in.
Penny.
I didn't mention before, I am also a millennial. I think I'm kind of at the midway point as far as like the spectrum of a millennial. Something that I have been thinking a lot about, not just professionally, but personally, is this definition of boundaries. And for me, historically, that has looked like kind of telling people what they can and can't do. And something that I've started to recognize is that boundaries are about me. They're about letting the workplace do what it does, and then defining for myself what I'm going to take, what I'm going to do. Will I push forward? Will I not push forward? It's really about my behavior. And so I think that there are millennials and portions of Gen Z who are realizing I might be in this workplace, but no one's done me a favor by hiring me here. It's a two-way street. This workplace is beneficial to me for whatever reasons, but I'm also an asset here. So for me, setting those like really healthy boundaries, or saying, I'm not going to try to control this entire situation. I'm going to define for myself what my limits are and really stick to those.
I think that's a great definition. Does anyone else want to add to that?
I mean, since I brought it up, I'll co-sign what Tenny just said. But also just, no one gets points for this, but I'm sure it's going to be said a lot today, since there are so many fundraisers here, but it's about relationships. How many times have we heard that, right? And the workplace relationship looks different. It seems much more personalized than it has in years or decades past. And it's also a time to redefine that workplace relationship. So that I think this is a good point in time, but as far as defining boundaries, that's going to depend on the job. That's going to depend on the people in that job, the employer, the employee, et cetera, et cetera. It's not just like, let's define this one way, have a cookie cutter relationship for everyone, because that didn't work. That's why we're here.
Yeah, and I think you find that these boundaries are really a confluence of multiple factors, as you were saying, Jared, like whether it's when you enter the workforce, what is going on in the economy at that time and what generation, and what your identity is. I know that for myself, I entered the workforce in the 90s as a Korean American second generation, a female who was raised in the South. And that certainly really colors kind of my relationship and my ability to set boundaries. And so I'm wondering for our panelists, obviously we see that culture, upbringing, generation, and other aspects of our identities intersect to shape how we exist within a workplace, how we work with other people. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your experience in terms of that boundary setting and how your identities intersected to kind of create your ability, or your not feeling like you can actually set appropriate boundaries to keep the workplace safe for you. Tenny, would you want to start us off on this one?
Sure.
Great.
So I am a Black woman. I'm also a first generation Nigerian American. And so for me, culturally, quitting in general just isn't great. You're not supposed to quit. You're supposed to really persevere. We're really taught to do our best in every situation, no matter how tired or overwhelmed, or even if we're in a situation that's unjust, really kind of looking on the bright side. And so it's easy to get kind of bogged down with things and be expected to take it with a smile. Also, this kind of notion of, you know, your parents came here. My parents in particular came to the States. They'd never even visited before. They got on a plane and this was just home. And so sometimes that can kind of bring about a feeling of like, is this really so bad? Especially living in the West, having the opportunity to get a college education, etc. And so for me, going above and beyond is always seemed like the standard. Just doing what you're asked to do is bare minimum and kind of not good enough. So trying to rewire that point of view it's difficult, it's hard. Sometimes you can kind of swing completely in the other direction and get really rigid as well and say like, this is my boundary. You can't like penetrate it. You can't do anything. Like I'm going to be as steadfast in saying no to everything as I can. So for me, my identity makes it a balancing act to take what I really value from my culture, but also bring in these concepts of mental health and self-care, things that just are kind of have traditionally been non-existent. That shows up in the workplace all the time. Obviously, that kind of achiever and perfectionist mindset. So overall, it's a balancing act every day.
It's a beautiful answer. Thank you. Would any of our other panelists like to share their experience and from their perspective?
I'll just jump in really quick and say, yeah, I guess I identify as late millennial / early Gen Z. I'm right there. And I came into the workforce right before COVID started, but certainly was taught to adapt very quickly into that world. And a couple of years into my career, I was supervising 2 Gen Z professionals who graduated college during COVID. And not only were they vastly different in their professional mannerisms and their dedication to the job, not positive or negative, just very different. So when we're talking about, different generational gaps, I think it's also interesting to talk about bridging the communication, not just looking at people as their generation, but also as the individual. As Jared was saying, it's the people and their jobs. And I think that's a really important point to touch.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of does lead us into our next question, which is sort of, based on your positions and your identities, what responsibility do you feel as individuals to trying to bridge the gaps between your colleagues? Because as again, Jared said, it is about relationships, right? And how we work within the workplace and how we build that culture. And then I'll add a second question just so I can step out of this, but this is what are risks that you are willing to take based on your identities? Jared, would you like to launch us in? I see.
Oh, I guess you saw my hand going to the mouse. Okay. Yeah. What was that first question again?
Was sort of based on your identity and your position, what responsibility do you feel to trying to bridge the generational gaps or the other gaps that you see within colleagues in your workplace?
Yeah, so in Jews and all Hues, we have a lot of private contractors and we have very few employees, but we try to treat everyone like family. And that also means having really tough conversations or giving a lot of space when needed, right? I'd rather somebody take the time that they need off of work and try to find people to cover than have them have a mental breakdown and then lose them in so many different ways, right? It we have to, I don't know, we try to be more human centered, and that also means revisiting bylaws and other things, policies and procedures when it comes to time off, when it comes to the day-to-day workforce flow. And I'm forgetting the second one, but
Oh, sure. And what risks do you find that you're willing to take in the workplace, just from your experience and
well,
perspective?
yeah, as an executive director, a lot of the risk that I take is with donors. Donors who demand that we have a set of colleagues who work in a very similar way to corporate America. And some of those donors have said, well, I don't like the way that you operate, so I'm not going to donate. Others have said, I don't care how you operate as long as you operate and get stuff done and achieve your goals and work towards your mission. So here. So I'm seeing that split. You know, there's this new set of donors who are more human centered, and then there's still the set of donors who are just like, if you don't work 20 hours a week, or I'm sorry, 20 hours a week, that'd be nice. But like, if you don't work 20 hours a day, and be thankful about it, and also work the way that I want my employees to work, where in a job where they may be like the lowest person on the chain there, then this organization, this mission is not worth it. And that's highly, I don't know, my organization deals with white supremacy, full stop. And
Yeah.
so we deal with white supremacy in the Jewish community on every level. We deal with like white supremacy, how it manifests inside of us people of color and all that. And that also means not going as far as we've gone in the past. That means not pushing people way past the brink for some ideology that never benefited us in the first place.
Yeah, I do want to just sort of kind of delve a little deeper, Jared, with you, and then certainly invite the rest of the panelists to inform as well. So do you feel that there are issues specific, and I actually can say you have identified issues that are specific to the nonprofit and philanthropic employment space that need to be addressed, particularly as it with regard to boundary setting, and then organizationally specific, like what changes need to be made? You've referred to human-centered management. And for those who aren't familiar with that term, I would love for you to just expand on that a little bit, and maybe some actionable recommendations for managers or directors who are attending this call. What can they do in their organizations to kind of build a more human-centered culture that supports boundary setting?
Well, one thing that nonprofits by and large get wrong, in my opinion, is that they don't ask the people what they actually need. We can drop examples like until everybody is blue in the face or some shade of blue, whatever. But that doesn't take away from the fact that we need to ask our employees, we need to ask our volunteers what they actually need to breathe and thrive in whatever position they're currently holding, because that's all we have, right? We only have people. If we could get into nonprofit work, hit a button, let AI take over, and everybody link into AI, there would be one employee in the entire United States for the entire nonprofit industrial complex. But that's not where we are. And our labor inside of nonprofit is the same as corporate America, but also different because there's an emotional and there's a personal component to it where we are chasing missions. We're not just creating products. A lot of nonprofits do create products as well, but we're chasing dreams, but also helping people to achieve things and meet people and connect and put more humanity into it. And that means a lot of emotional labor. Right. And emotional labor, it's a different weight than going to a job that you may hate, you may loathe, whatever word or term you're going to use, but you just do your job and it doesn't really take that much off of you, right? Whereas, like, if you are working with kids with cancer, that's a different ball of wax. That's a different weight. So an hour spent in that space is different than spending 40 hours a week, right? And oftentimes, people who sit on boards, or whether you call them board members or trustees or whatever your nonprofit structure is, come into this space with a notion that everything has to be like corporate America. Well, corporate America was built on supremacy, right? Corporate America wasn't built for human beings to have breaks, right? We had to fight for that. Unions had to fight for a 2-day weekend. Some are fighting for a 3-day weekend, otherwise we'd be working 7 days a week. There wouldn't be an HR department. Right, there wouldn't be laws on the books telling you can't work your workers to death, right? And yet there are people in positions of power inside of nonprofit structures that still come in with that because either they think that this is the one space where they can exert that power that they've been longing to exert, or that's how they were raised. Right. And they need to be re-educated, because even if you are a board member, even if you are a major donor, no one owns this space called nonprofit. Right. The entity itself, the nonprofit entity, owns this space sort of. Right. But it's all people driven. It's all heart connected. It's not something that can easily it can't be bought or sold, actually, but it exists and it breathes and it lives in the hearts and minds of people that you serve. So those are my 2 cents about it.
Love it. I mean, I do love your phrase that it's heart connected and that it's grounded in people. And I really want to go back to this notion of human-centered management and building human-centered workplaces. I know that specifically in my career, I've been working in the nonprofit space as a caregiver, and that is one of the hardest challenges, right? To balance the boundary testing that happens in terms of containing work that is driven by your heart and driven by this idealism, and then wanting to actually be able to care for the ones that are in your stead. And so I'm wondering if any of our panelists want to speak to that in terms of building a supportive, safe workplace. What does that look like from a caregiver perspective or from a management perspective? Because I know that can be a challenge when you have certain boundaries that have to be placed, right? At 3 o'clock, I'm out because I have to pick up my kid or things like that. Jessi, I see you nodding.
Yeah. Well, so my direct report's on this call, so I'll invite her to call me to task if anything I say is incorrect or not matching in her experience. But I think Jared hit it on the head when you talked about that human-centric approach. I think for me, some real tangential things that I've done is to talk, to really know what the job description says, to revisit that job description. I think that's something that in the past, once it's posted and we fill that role, it's not something I'm revisiting, to really understand where the women on my team want to go. I think the 5-year plan question's a little outdated, but what is their goal or what is their ideal next step, and be really transparent and clear in ways I am helping them get there, even if that there is not necessarily at Chicago Foundation for Women. And so being really genuine in my investment in their future and transparent around that. And I think too, there's a lot of work to be done on the traditional performance appraisal. I've been in a lot of places where folks say, we just don't get 5s here, or we don't get 4s here. And if we are trying to motivate and we are trying to have folks fulfill their job description, I think that we need to take another look at that. And then as far as the risk I'm willing to take, we talk about identities a lot here on the call. And I think for women, and I'm from Chicago Foundation for Women, so this is always the lens I'm going to use, but a lot of women, their experiences are not that they can take this quiet quitting risk, that oftentimes they feel they need to go above and beyond or work twice as hard as their male colleagues. And I imagine this is doubly true for women of color. And so as a white woman on a team with a lot of women of color, how am I willing to leverage and be a voice saying, this isn't really working, so that other people aren't feeling that they're being put at risk, and absorbing some of that risk myself to a point where I'm comfortable. I will say CFW is a great place to be a working woman. It's a great place to be a working mom. And so we're really fortunate there, but that isn't always everyone's experience at every place, right?
So true. Thank you, Jessi. Tenny, would you like to speak to that other?
Yeah, of course. Jessi is telling the truth. Everything that she said, I can definitely attest to. I think this, especially this idea, not just as, a woman of color having a manager who is white, kind of absorbing some of those, kind of putting our ideas out there and absorbing some of that risk. I think that just on like a hierarchy level, as a manager, being able to take feedback from your team and take it back to the higher ups, that's helpful. It's helpful to be able to speak transparently to someone that I'm working with on a day-to-day basis, and know that that feedback is going to make its way kind of up the chain, so to speak. That's been something that I've really valued about my working relationship with Jessi. And again, we're in nonprofit, and there is, to Jared's point, this emotional component. But I think we do work within these capitalist structures. There are ways that nonprofits function like a for-profit, like a corporation. And so just to have the space to reimagine what work can look like in this sector, I think we get a lot of space to discuss that at CFW. And that makes for, a lot of space and transparency to at least dream of what could be different, how we can be.
That's beautiful. We will get to, I want to hear more about that in a little bit. I want to stay a little bit in the space of this human-centered management approach. And all 4 of you actually are managers in different capacities. So I'm seeing some questions come up around this idea of what would a human-centric appraisal approach look like? What does that review process look like? I'm wondering if anyone would like to speak to that, like really in some detail, like really make that more tactical in terms of your response. Anyone? Jessi, would you like
to?
Sure,
since I brought it to the table, I can answer for that a little bit. I will say, I think that grading thing that seems to carry over into performance reviews is a little bit out of date. I think that, a lot of the performance reviews I've been a part of receiving and also giving have really been, what's that final score? And I think that that's not a really helpful conversation. And I think it can be a little more punitive. We know we need performance reviews or something like that as a tool. If you're ultimately making a decision to part ways with a person, you have to have that documentation, et cetera. So I want to be really useful in my feedback because I see them as a good tool, but I think they really need to focus on the value that that employee is bringing to the table. Tenny talked a lot about bringing your whole self to work and what are you getting out of the role and what are you giving? And I think that framing the conversation around that is really, really important. And so I think even the format of performance reviews, even if you're getting to the same conversation, really needs to change. Because that scoring model, I don't think is what is needed for today's employee.
Yeah, I'll agree with that wholeheartedly. I'll also say that just to dovetail off of what Jessi just said, as far as like how the employee, shows up in the culture of the workplace. If that employee had a rough year, but inspires others, and still is competent in their job, I wouldn't fire that person. I wouldn't let them go, because we all have rough patches. We all have rough years, rough weeks, rough days, and to hold that against someone, I guess we run people like they're machines, right? We are not machines. Having a standard where everybody must meet XYZ, just like standardized testing. Standardized testing doesn't tell you much about the person's intelligence or what may motivate them to learn what they don't know, right? That a piece of paper is not going to tell you that unless it's in narrative form, maybe. But just to say, like, our even in nonprofit reviews, being more human-centric for me means like we have to take everything into account, but also beyond that one person, right? Not just what their performance is, but like if they are a good team player and they add to the team, if they're somebody that like either somebody confides in or whatever, maybe that person would be good for like an HR track or something, or management in some way, shape, or form. But how is an entire organization going to feel at the end of the day with this person in it versus without them?
Yeah.
And just to bounce off of that, in regards to performance review is not an individual meeting, right? It's an ongoing process, and it's certainly no time for surprises. So that should be something that's happening in weekly one-on-ones, and so that the employee is also very aware of the things they can improve on, but also the space is created by the managers for them to manage up as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that Jamie is here. Is there a question that has popped up?
We have so many questions, so I'm kind of I was trying to fit them in around the conversations a little bit. And this one is from Carol. And she actually, it's directed to you, Tenny. She said, when you say that you have conversations about reimagining what work could look like, what kinds of things have you created together? And she said, this must go beyond just giving extra days off, et cetera. And I'd love to know more about it.
Yeah, there's a question later on that kind of touches on this, but I think that I can speak to kind of my working relationship with Jessi. We talked a little bit about that. What types of risks are you willing to take in the workplace? Really radical transparency is something that I have not experienced with a manager before. Having the ability to speak to what I really think, maybe about an organizational decision, maybe a conversation with a funder. I think that as fundraisers, we all know funders that are really particular, and just to be able to express that frustration transparently is a way of being able to bring my whole self to work. I mean, we keep it professional, but I think that there's some conversations that I've had with Jessi that I would not have had with maybe others, and certainly not in other workplaces. So it doesn't feel like a risk to say what's really on my mind and what I really think. And I think that is, at least for me as a Black woman in the workplace, that is definitely kind of a reimagining. And to touch a little bit on, that question of how can work be different? I think it not being one size fits all, to be able to bring a really equitable lens, and that equity is meeting people exactly where they are. 9 to 5 just doesn't work for everyone. I'm a mom. If I leave the office at 5, I'm late. to pick my child up. That doesn't work for everyone. Being in the office doesn't work for everyone. Sometimes you've got colleagues who have a disability or who are neurodivergent and you don't even know. I mean, bringing your whole self has its limits. You need boundaries around that as well. So you don't know what somebody else is maybe dealing with. You don't know what their situation looks like. And so if you see somebody maybe leaving work a little bit early every day, not questioning their need, but having trust in your organization or at least in your colleagues that their needs are valid. They're going to look a little bit different than mine. Nothing's being taken away from me because they get this accommodation, but also being able to speak up for yourself in that regard and say, that would really be great for me in my situation too. I can go to my colleague and talk a little bit about what was that process and in talking to Jessi about, a flexible schedule. What exactly did you say? What's the script? What did the process look like? And on my end, being open to share that information with colleagues as well, so that they can, get whatever needs met or accommodations that they need. Hopefully that answers your question, Carol.
And Tenny, Jamie, is it okay if I pop in?
Yeah, pop in.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Tenny, I feel like what you're really talking about is this creation of a safe work space, right? And this notion of safety, be able to be open and honest and authentic and truly your whole self. So I have a couple questions for you and for Jessi in that, because really, how do you build that sort of relationship? Because in my experience, I've seen that happen in sort of mid-level management to other employees, but as an entire organization, I'm not sure that I've witnessed that be the entire organization's culture. And so I would love to know, how do you actually tactically, again, build that out?
I guess I can jump in. I think, we're not a huge team. CFW has between 15 and 20 employees at any given time, but being a women-centric organization, being an organization committed to anti-racism, that has us confronting some of those long-held professional values. Jared touched on it with white supremacy. And so I think that it is not easy. There are a lot of challenges there. We have to hold ourselves accountable. We have to have conversations with senior leadership, with the board, and they have to have conversations with us too. But it really all goes down to trust. And if you can't have that trust with the people on your team, then that's a performance conversation. And so rather than being punitive because some people, aren't able to meet their job descriptions, really holding that accountability, but then providing that trust in return is really what we've and we're still working on it. We're not perfect by any means, but that is the direction that we're really pushing ourselves to go as an organization. And our president and CEO often says equity doesn't mean everyone gets the same thing. It means people are getting what they need. And that's a phrase that we continue to come back to.
Beautiful.
I'll just say that. Oh, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, Jared.
Go ahead, Jared. Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, I've been told that team meetings for Jews in all Hues look terribly different from other team meetings, because we usually start out with an emotional aspect, or just a check-in to make sure that if somebody needs to vent about something, like everything stays in the room. It does not weigh on performance or anything, but it's just a space for people to vent. And even if it's about me, right? Like, I'm not perfect. And we've had some people sit in on these team meetings and just say, wow, like it's totally different. Because usually when they get into meetings, everyone's right to business. And we work in the DEI space, so like right to business also means whatever baggage you're bringing in. Not everything, like nothing gets stripped out when you enter the doorway or anything like that. I also have a futon in my office for like if somebody is in the office and they are just that darn tired, best to like just take a cat nap or something and do a check-in, then keep pushing yourself, and then possibly having some type of medical event later. Same thing. Like same thing as like offices that keep certain products around that help out with their employees' health and well-being. I'm not saying everybody needs like a Google buffet or anything like that, but hopefully you're able to pay your employees well enough that they can actually afford lunch. But that's a different thing.
Right.
But just to say, like, there are things that you can do in practice that lead to a healthier environment. Also, yeah, I also really hate 9 to 5. I will chop up my work day where some of it will be at night. Part of it is also because I have a 2-month-old daughter, and literally after this, I'm going to pick up my son at school, right? So it's, my day isn't going to be completely 9 to 5 either, or whatever executive directors might have to do, which would be maybe 6 in the morning till 10 at night. Depends on whether or not it's a conference or whatever, but it's not going to be linear like that, and that's okay.
Yeah, so I think what I'm hearing are some of the tactics that would help build that safe workplace that's really human-centered is listening and trust, flexibility, being willing to be flexible and not have a one-size-fits-all solution. And then I love, Jared, that you also brought up the physical space of what that looks like within a virtual realm. I'm very curious about how that also works. But I do think it's a beautiful notion that within in-person workplaces, that absolutely your physical space is going to communicate your philosophy and sort of how you want your employees to feel, right? Jamie, I'm not sure if there are other questions that wanted to come up before we get to the visioning, like the actual question, but
yeah, no, why don't you get through that one? I have lots of questions, so why don't you get through the next part, and then I'll do a rapid fire with the panel.
Oh, sounds great. Thank you, Jamie. So our final prepared question for the panelists, really, I think we sort of merged into this conversation, but I do want to hear from everybody on this one, which is with this notion of boundary setting within a workplace and creating safe workplaces, what will the workplace of the future in ideal look like? And then how do we make that happen? And I know we've already started down this path, but I would love to hear some more from everybody. Cal, do you want to start us off?
Sure. To reimagine a work culture in place, I would say that when an employee is being interviewed or onboarded as well, being able to talk about what their needs are, and as well as what the company organization's needs are. So if they say that they need X amount of tasks and done in this week, being able to customize when that workflow is happening. As Jared said, like, it varies beyond, each person and whatever they have all going on in their personal life and their professional goals, and they shouldn't have to choose between one and the other. So I think it's really important to be able to find out early on and constantly, not just after the onboarding concludes, being able to understand what people need day to day in their jobs.
Okay. Thank you, Cal. Jessi?
I think we're all nonprofit folks. A lot of us are fundraisers, and I can say it's the Wild West out there for job hunting, for recruiting fundraisers. So there's no shortage of opportunities. And so I think organizations are going to get on board, or they're going to kind of learn the hard way that if you're not willing to meet these new flexible standards of this next generation, and even others who have gotten a taste of remote work and all that extra commute time that they have back for their own lives, they're going to see that in a decrease in retention. And so I think getting ahead of it so that you're not losing institutional knowledge, so you're not having that high turnover and all the challenges that come with it, is really going to be critical to do that sooner or later, to meet your employees where they are and meet those needs.
Great, thank you. Jared?
I think the future is more communal. That may mean smaller organizations or even larger organizations getting together, taking pieces of their budget to combine an effort to relieve some of the stress off of their employees altogether, whether that's like forming a new childcare initiative or some other mental health thing, working with other organizations to create maybe a spot for therapeutic sessions or something. That doesn't have to be all on one organization, that it can be a common responsibility, that we not only take care of our own employees and our own people, but that we also invest in the people in other organizations, because let's be honest, like every field has multiples of the same mission and type of organization. So no one organization is necessarily the be all end all, right? So the more we invest not only in our people, but the people around us and our entire human community, I think the better the field will be, and the more people will be motivated to do things, and be inspired to go in whatever direction they will. So that's my hope anyway.
Hope so too. And Tenny.
Yeah, I've spoken to this a little bit already. I think another important piece is to listen, not listen to respond, but listen to really understand where someone on your team is coming from. And even if it's not something within your own lived experience, again, having that trust, to really show and prove that you are here to support this team member, and that you believe them. I think that for people of marginalized identities, we're often dealing with just not being believed that this experience was sexist or racist or homophobic. Believe your people, trust them, and that muscle will be built not just in them, but in you to like continue to have this more radical transparency with one another.
I love the notion of radical transparency. Thank you for introducing that term. So Jamie, I know I'll buy the panelists just a second to prep yourselves for the rapid fire from our audience. And thank you all so much for all of your beautiful responses and for engaging with us as an audience. I can't wait to hear the questions.
There's so many. I think I am going to throw one to you, Cal. And I know you're always up for rapid fire. This is the question from Anonymous. As a Gen Xer, can you provide tips as to how to motivate Gen Zers to be more productive and dedicated to work while respecting their boundaries? I would like this to focus on the motivation side and come from the perspective that the boundaries and home life will be respected. And anyone can jump in on this, but I was tossing it to Cal first.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, I think this goes back to what we've all been saying about not having to choose between personal and professional life. As far as motivation goes, I think or earlier into the career, into the workforce generations really care about growth transparency and really understanding if they do this, what will happen next in that role. Whether or not they want to be promoted to a more, a higher responsibility role, they at least know what the red carpet looks like to get there. And I also think that it completely varies, whether it's a company or an organization. It really comes down to the communication of asking the employee what they need, what they want, and also being able to communicate what the organization will need from them for that to be able to happen.
Great. Anyone else on the panel want to weigh in on that? Okay, I will.
I'll just say.
Jared does. Okay, go. Yep, absolutely.
I don't know. Growing up, I too am an elder millennial. Thank you, Eliza Schlesinger, for naming that in the comedy special. But I'll say that like every generation that I've studied calls the next generation lazy or unmotivated. Instead of laying that judgment on that generation, I think it's incumbent upon us to seek to understand, as Teddy said. That again, asking those questions about needs and worldview, maybe, or other parts of humanity that may not be particularly in the job description. I mean, I talk with my accountant about things that don't have to do with numbers, right? So that's just to say, like, we have to get over these assumptions that the next generation is going to have less, or may have less, but like is going to be less than we are. And I think part of that is put into that question.
Got it. That's great. So this is kind of a follow-up question, and I think I'm going to direct this to you, Jessi. This is from Sophia, and she said, can we touch upon the difference between going above and beyond versus doing too much for what the employee is being compensated for? And then the follow-up to that was, and how both or either of these things can lead to employee burnout.
Yeah, so I think that's a really great question. So I would say we've seen it a lot. I think a lot of organizations have had reduced staff during COVID. Moms have had to step away, positions have changed, et cetera. And so I think we've seen a lot of folks take on work of their colleagues that at one point in time when you were fully staffed was another person's entire position, right? And so I think that question has a lot of basis in the reality right now, because we are seeing people take on additional job descriptions. I think above and beyond means that these items are in your job description and you are taking an extra step to make sure, with fundraising, that might look like giving the donor just the most excellent experience, sending an additional news article that you saw, really being intentional and thoughtful about the items within your job description, and communicating back to the rest of your team how you are doing that work and sharing that information. Whereas, I think a lot of folks are being asked to do additional labor, or even as organizations are battling or wrestling with equity and this racial reckoning our country has been having. I know I've seen a lot of my friends who are colleagues of color at other organizations being asked to take on DEI work, for example, which is outside of their job description, but because they are people of color, it's assumed that they have that expertise and they should take on that burden. And so I think being really mindful, as Jared just put in chat to me, this other duties as assigned, not taking advantage of that. And I think that the job descriptions are actually as useful tools for managers as they are for employees who are trying to manage that balance.
Great. That was super helpful. It was great. I'm not sure to point this one to, so I'm going to throw this to all of you and someone can jump in. How do you tackle high achievers overextending themselves with management, and the other side of it being with management that's always trying to, who wants more and expects more of you? And how do you know, what does this look like with kind of a limited team, like, which is typical of a lot of nonprofits? Jared?
Well, what are the stated goals for that person, right?
Right.
Also, sometimes overachievement is also a form of, I'm not saying this for everyone or in every case, but sometimes it's a form of escape, just like watching Netflix for the entire time that you're not at work, right? And that can be very toxic, right? That could be the burnout person, right? But also, like, I know that in my organization, we have a lot of Jewish women of color that we hire, and I often have to have conversations, not just about like where the limits are for the organization, because I want to be clear. I want them to tell me what the limits are, especially if they're a private contractor. So I know you're probably paying your private contractors more than you're paying your employees. So just there's a balance there. But also just to touch on like compensation in general, like that's also a boundary, right? That can also be a boundary. That can also be that is definitely part of the relationship, and seeing where maybe we're undercompensating people and that's putting a crunch on them somewhere else, right? Maybe they can just afford rent, and if they can just afford rent, maybe they can afford that sandwich once a week or something like that. That's not, for me, that's not having an employee, that's having a really, that's having an intern or something, as expecting someone to get those resources somewhere else. And if they have to get those resources somewhere else, then they're going to need a second job. And that means everything's going to suffer here as well.
Thank you. No, thank you for that. We are at time. And so I just want to take a moment to thank all of you on the panel for such great conversation and feedback. We've gotten so much positive remarks about this in the chat, and people that I know that are on the call right now have been texting me to say how much they appreciate this conversation. So thank all of you. I will be sending out an email to all of you with a recording from today. And I'll also be sending out, I'm going to try to get in touch with Noah about her Mad Libs performance review form. I think that looks really cool. So I will include that as well. But if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me directly, jamie@evolvegg.com, or any of my colleagues. We're happy to answer your questions or continue the conversation offline. But have a great afternoon, and thanks again for joining us.